sorry for being late. We got caught in traffic coming back. I was invited to speak at the, what was it called? The Inland Empire Islamic Center. And it was actually very interesting because they gave me a half hour to speak as Lynn's spokesman. And people were very calm and quiet at first, and then gradually loosened up, and by the end of it, it was actually very exciting because people were asking questions like, why should anyone in the world trust the United States if we come in and tell them we're going to help them build a railroad after what we've been doing in the world? So it was a very interesting discussion. Anyway, I'll at least do an introduction of some of the work I wanted to cover over the next few weeks. The idea, one of the things that came up at our recent conference was this whole question of the relationship between arts and sciences. And probably some of you are students who study the liberal arts, so to speak. Some of you may be science majors, and of course when I was in school, the science guys were the tech nerds, and we stayed away from them. They had their own student union at Wisconsin, where the engineers hung out, and the chemistry guys. And back then, they still carried slide rules, and they'd have their thing with pens in it, and there are 60 pens in a pocket. They'd always have one that leaked, and they have ink dripping down their shirt. And so us liberal art guys were cool because we'd grow our hair long and skip classes and basically figure out how to bullshit our way through any test. In fact, I even took a course once in meteorology, and I convinced the professor to give me extra credit for writing a paper on meteorology as a liberal art. So he went for it. At Wisconsin, we had something called Physics for Poets. And it was taught by a professor named Ugo Camerini. And he gave you take-home essay tests. And just as a test one time, I had a very bright girlfriend back then, and I copied her test completely. She got an A and I got a C. So it wasn't exact science for physics back then. Probably his students are the ones who are building the smart bombs that the U.S. is pointing at Iraq right now. But anyway, the question of science and arts, what's the connection? And what you find if you actually look at this, and this is something that impressed me from the beginning about Lynn, is the idea of the gap. Why is it that there's such a gap between them? And this goes back to something that happened in the middle of the 19th century, where the concept of Geisteswissenschaft, which means the study of the spirits or the mind, the arts, versus Naturwissenschaft, the study of nature, of the sciences. And if you think about it, if you look at some of the great scientists in the past, you find that there was a clear connection between science and art. I mean, just take a look at the dome there. We've had classes on the method of construction of that dome. That was the space project of its day. The construction of that dome in Florence, the famous Brunelleschi's dome. And it's a work of art. If any of you have been to Florence, you stand up in the hillsides looking down at the city, and it's an incredibly beautiful construction. And at the same time, it was one that was done using scientific principles which were unknown, or certainly not understood, at the time Brunelleschi undertook building the dome. You look at Leonardo, and you look at some of Leonardo's sketches, his work with water, and you see beautiful little drawings. In fact, you take a look at something like La Gioconde, also known as the Mona Lisa, and everyone focuses on the smile. But what's back behind her? Well, if you look in the picture, you'll see there's a bridge, there's an aqueduct, there's roads, there's waterways. There's actually, Leonardo has demonstrated the relationship between human beauty and man's activity in nature. And so you have the connection in this way very often, in ways we don't even think about it, between art and science. Because a scientific experiment is something which is undertaken outside of the physical senses. That is, as Lynn has always said, to make an advance in science, you don't see gravity. It's not something, you could say you see the effects. If you drop something, it falls, but just doing that doesn't tell you what it is or how to measure it, or is it universal? Is it part of a universal physical principle, or is it just something that happens at a certain speed here and another speed in another part of the world? So actually, scientific advance takes place in the same way that artistic advance takes place, in the imagination, in the capacity of the mind to make a hypothesis and to discover through a hypothesis whether your conception of something in the physical world is right or not. And in art, what you're doing is you're also trying to come up with new ideas, new ways of communicating ideas, because that's really what art represents. Historically, you go back to the Greeks, you go back to the Egyptians. What was the purpose of art? I mean, I'm sure there was nobody in Egypt who dipped a tennis ball in paint and whacked it off a canvas and tried to sell it. But you can buy that today if you want, if you have a lot of money. Or is it Jackson Pollock, I think, did that? No, why did the Egyptians undertake art? Well, they were trying to say something about their civilization, about their society, about what they were doing, about what they were learning. And so this question, you hear this thing in the 20th century, art for art's sake. Art's something that makes me feel good. Performance art. I can roll around and paint, and I can become my own canvas. I can get up on stage and stick a carrot up my ass and tell people, this is something new. I am an art, piece of art. And people do that. I think we have our friend in the back, the budding physicist, Sky, who was trying to combine performance art and physics. Well, you could say that was done before when people stuck their fingers into electric sockets and things like that. People are experimenting. But the question of art and science in human history is it's for a purpose. It's for a purpose of advancing, improving the conditions of mankind. A scientist who becomes a scientist because they want to win a Nobel Prize and make a lot of money is not going to be a good scientist. Just like an artist who sets out by saying, I'll get rich, I'll be the most popular artist ever, and so I'll be famous and make a lot of money. If you look at what goes on in modern art today, what you find is that it's often the most ugly creations which are considered the most brilliant. I'll never forget being in southern France and going to the Picasso Museum. It's basically a small castle somewhere just north of Avignon. And you go in, and here's Picasso. He spent his last 5 years of his life there, so you figure, here's this great, brilliant artist. What was he doing the last 5 years of his life? What was his final legacy to mankind? And you go in, and the walls are filled with his legacy. Plates with stick figures on them. Stick figures like a 3-year-old makes. Now, I was looking at this, and I went up to the curator, and I said, what gives? What's this all about? And she said, in his genius, he reverted at the end of his life to the highest truth. I said, a stick figure? That's what it's all about? And then you saw what it's really all about. They're manufacturing these in the back, and they're selling them. They had different molds. He had about 12 different stick figures. They cut a mold for it. I was wondering why these plates were $250 each. And you could see some jackass American in there, I like that one, and yeah, that's a good one there. My wife will like that. And I need a whole set for my mistress. You just get a sense of these dumb Texans will buy anything, right, Tim? I'm not calling on him because he's a dumb Texan. He knows dumb Texans. Now, what I want to show you is actually how there's an interrelationship between scientific advance, the advance of artistry, the ability to communicate and convey powerful ideas, ideas that are non-existent one moment and the next minute shape the society. And the relationship of that to political advance. That what we need to do today is not just stop a war. Suppose we stopped Bush from bombing Iraq. Well, then there's North Korea. There's Iran. If he really gets mad, there's our office here. He's not too happy with a lot of people coming around listening to LaRouche's ideas. But you don't stop a war by just being against a war. One of the things, I'm sure Nick talked about this, but one of the most beautiful things that happened over the last couple of weeks is that not only are the French, the Germans, and the Russians finding commonality against the war, but they're saying, look, we have a way of achieving peace through economic development, through building in areas of the world which are now wastelands, to make them habitable for man, to make them beautiful gardens, and to give a population a reason to want to work and produce. This idea of the Eurasian land bridge of LaRouche. And it was interesting because at this Pakistani mosque where we just were, one of the things, you find something interesting. If you talk to people who are Muslims from Pakistan, you know one thing. They don't have any problem understanding British. They know what the British were about. The British were the ones who divided India and Pakistan and set the basis for Muslim-Hindu confrontation, just as they did the same thing in the Middle East between Jews and Muslims. So, but one of the things that was interesting, I told them, do you realize what a radical concept this is to have Russia, France, and Germany allied? And they were all nodding in agreement. Now, if you were at a graduate seminar in most universities in the United States and you said it, people would say, well, what's the big deal? So what? Well, World War I was caused because the British could not tolerate the idea of Russia, France, and Germany in an alliance. And they put Hitler in power in Germany, and they destroyed Russia for the purposes of having, again, World War II to keep Russia and Germany from allying, as they almost did in 1922 with the Rapallo Agreement. So, to change history, it's not enough to say, well, we're against war and we're for good things. You heard Bush's speech the other night. He said, well, we'll get rid of Saddam Hussein and then we'll get rid of all the dictators and there'll be peace and prosperity and everyone will be happy. Now, if Clinton would have said that, the Republicans would have said, what's he smoking? But Bush goes out and says it, and, some people listen to it. How are you going to establish peace and prosperity by blowing up a region? So the question is, how do you know what the basis for peace is? What do you know about the nature of man? Because the great artists and the great scientists are dealing with the ultimate art, which is the creation of a livable human society. That's why, who was it? It was Shelley who said poets are the legislators. The idea that what you do with art shows how you treat your human society, whether you treat humans with dignity and respect, or whether you treat them as a bunch of suckers who will buy stick figures for large amounts of money, while you go down in history as a great figure. So I want to give you just the idea was a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a couple of months ago now, we had the good fortune of having come into our region a somewhat accomplished pianist who could work with some of the other almost accomplished pianists that we have. And the idea was, why don't we do something more than just have dueling pianos? Why don't we work on a project to actually get at this question of what is creativity and how is creativity realized in music? And so one of the things we looked at was a paper that LaRouche wrote a number of years ago with the odd title, Beethoven is a Physical Scientist. Now, the issue here that I'm going to look at tonight is this question of the interrelation of art, science, and statecraft. But this will be an introduction to a broader process of actually taking a look at some of the principles of composition and looking at it through probably one of the most highly developed creative individuals who's ever been on the planet, Ludwig van Beethoven. Now, how many of you think you know something about this individual, Beethoven? Just something. You know approximately when he lived. You know whether he was a man or a woman. How many of you have seen the movie Immortal Beloved? All right, well then I hope you don't think that was Ludwig van Beethoven. That was Mick Jagger in period costume. It was not the real story of Beethoven. Now, what we're going to look at, and I'll give you some glimpses tonight into this figure, but I want to start by showing you one of the most extraordinary periods in human history. The period between 1776 and 1826. What do I do? All right. Who knows how to use this? Ed.
The bulb has to be pushed over all the way.
Which is the bulb. All right. As you can tell, my artistry has not yet advanced to the point. All right. Now, we're going to take a look at a few of the individuals who basically are responsible for creating a world in which 6+ billion people could live, and a world which could be a beautiful world if we only could get our act together. And we start with Kepler, who Deborah introduced to some of you the other night. Kepler's work on discovering, essentially bringing astronomy into the modern era. And he did it by going back to rediscover things the Greeks already knew. But most importantly for the subject was his search for harmony, his looking at the universe and saying there's got to be principles of harmony that govern things, because we know that God did not create a random universe. So how can we discover what those organizing principles were? Now, Kepler, for our purposes, and there are many other people, this is a somewhat simplified, but Kepler was a physical scientist, someone who came up with hypotheses, who experimented with them, and Kepler's known primarily for proving something that was already known to the Greeks, that is that the sun is at the center of the solar system, but the orbits are not Aristotelian circles, but actually ellipses, and that this meant that there was non-uniform motion, and so there had to be a way of measuring these things which could not be done using the existing mathematics of the time. And he left the project to Leibniz, who invented calculus initially to study the motion, planetary motion, to be able to come up with ways of measuring things which are not uniform. Now, Leibniz, as you probably don't know, many of you don't know, was also an important political figure. Leibniz was involved in modernizing Russia through work with Peter the Great. He had agents in China trying to figure out how did Chinese civilization function. He was German himself. He spent time in Hanover. He actually was involved in a conspiracy that unfortunately didn't work out the way he intended. The wrong House of Hanover individual ended up on the throne of England. Had he had his way, the American Revolution would have spread to England before it spread to the United States. Instead, we ended up with the idiot George I, who spawned George II and George III, similar to our own George problem in this country. And we had to fight a revolution against them. But Leibniz was involved in a fight to transform England. He also was extremely influential in the establishment of our own nation. And I would call your attention to a series of excellent articles in the New Fidelio magazine that go through the influence of Leibniz on establishing both the scientific advances of a product ultimately of Leibniz, Gauss, who Sky and others have been doing some work with, but also the role through this and Kessler in helping Benjamin Franklin create the United States. Because Leibniz's idea, you know why we have life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness instead of life, liberty, and property in our Constitution? Because of Leibniz, who was at war with a man named John Locke. who thought slavery was a good system and thought that the only thing you could know is what you see, touch, taste, and hear, as opposed to Leibniz, who understood the principles of hypothesis. I'm going through some of this quickly, but I'm just giving you a sense. You had Kepler, Leibniz, Kessler. Now, interestingly, here we see someone, Johann Sebastian Bach. Was he a scientist? Was he an artist? We don't know too much about what he did politically. But actually, he took the ideas from Kepler and Leibniz in developing what we now have as the musical scale, which has been used by composers since Bach's time. Now, if we go this way, as I said, Kessler to Gauss. Gauss took the work of Leibniz and extended it. And how did he do it? He also went back to the Greeks. And I'm sure if you can get some of our young people here going after I'm done, you could stay up here all night taking a look at some of what Gauss did that has immediate impact for our youth movement, because Lynn has said that by looking at what Gauss did to take science back to Leibniz and back to the Greeks so that we understand mathematics not as something that has to do with numbers as a priori existence, but actually has to do with measuring physical motion, looking at the world from the standpoint of physical geometry, which, by the way, is an artistic, a very elegant approach. You'll see again how the connections work. And then Kessler had a student named Lessing. Lessing was a very important figure in Germany. He wrote a book or a play called Nathan the Wise, which was about toleration, religious toleration. It was about Nathan, who was a Jew in Germany at a time in which there was anti-Semitism. The Jews in Germany had very little freedom. And Lessing's collaborator, Moses Mendelssohn, was one of the most influential people in taking European Jews from the Middle Ages to the advances in the modern age. And they were dramatists, essay writers. Mendelssohn took the works of Plato and updated Plato's Phaedo, which is about the question of the immortality of the soul. Now, Lessing and Mendelssohn also had an impact, very profound impact, on Friedrich Schiller, for whom the Schiller Institute is named, our institute. And their concern was what? The beauty of man. How do you give man the possibility of becoming a beautiful soul so that we can govern our lives in a way that's truly human? Now, what I'm going to concentrate on this evening is the relationship between Schiller and Beethoven in particular. But of course, you had Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, three revolutionaries, because Haydn was the first one to develop a principle called motifurum, the idea that you take a theme, a motif, at a beginning of a piece that could just be two notes, and that theme becomes the basis for the entire 3 or 4 movements of a piece. Now, does that mean you just have two notes like bom, bom, and you keep repeating that? Bom, bom. Well, that would be probably not a bad start for the Beatles, but you'd never get anything more than boom, 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 boom. But actually, the question of developing, starting with two notes and developing a piece. Mozart took Haydn's work and revolutionized it. We'll get into this next time, Mozart's revolution. But then Beethoven took it much further. And that's what we'll be looking at over the next probably 3 to 4 weeks. But now, this is not a complete schema of what actually was going on. And let me see if this will actually work out. Because superimposed on this, there was profound political change in the same period. You had the American Revolution, 1776 to 1783, based on the idea of man of Leibniz, the idea of man implicit in Lessing and Mendelssohn, the idea of a republic, that each citizen is capable of self-governing. You don't need a king, you don't need a duke, You don't need a prince. Each of us is capable of developing our capacity so we can act for the interest of the whole nation. What's called the general welfare, which was in the U.S. Constitution, which was written between 1787 and 1789. There was a movement for this. Our American Revolution was incomplete and unfinished. We had to have we nearly lost the country. We beat the British and then they nearly got us back. Except for a couple of people, in particular Alexander Hamilton, who with Benjamin Franklin, who by the way, as I mentioned, was very much influenced by Kessner, was working directly with Kessner in the circles of Kessner in Germany to advance the ideas of Leibniz. Franklin got Hamilton to launch a movement to create a constitution. But this great hope, which influenced Friedrich Schiller tremendously, which influenced all of Europe, the idea that we could break the bondage of imperial emperors, rulers, bishops who had control, and instead have institutions of self-government, got sidetracked by the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a period of devastation in Europe. Most people today talk about, oh, Napoleon brought freedom to these places, but then he went bad. Gee, the French Revolution, liberty, brotherhood, equality, what's wrong with that? Well, yeah, everybody equally got their heads cut off. The French Revolution turned into a barbaric moment, which actually led to the Weimar Classical period, which was essentially based on Schiller, Lessing, Mendelssohn, and the musicians here. The period in Germany where in a brief period of years you had probably the most intense period of creative development, which was then crushed at the end of the Napoleonic Wars with the Congress of Vienna, which Lynn sometimes calls the sexual Congress of Vienna, because what was done is that Metternich and Talleyrand used a stable of prostitutes to basically keep the heads of state who were involved busy, while the British were writing the orders for the post-Napoleonic Europe. And out of the Congress of Vienna in 1818, the Carlsbad Decrees, which outlawed the works of Schiller, made it illegal to perform a Schiller play anywhere in Germany. You could go to jail for even talking about setting up a Schiller play. So from this overview, I want to show you a few aspects of the development of this remarkable individual, Beethoven. Now, actually I should have left that up there. The interrelationship between Mozart, Beethoven, Schiller, Lessing, all of these people, a lot of it occurred in the city of Vienna. Vienna was the capital of Austria, which was the center of the Habsburgs. Now, the Habsburgs were one of the most brutal of the ruling families in Europe for most of the period from the 1500s, because the Habsburgs were at the center of the launching of religious war in 1511, up through the period we're looking at. But an interesting thing happened. There was an emperor named Joseph II at about the 1780s. And Joseph II was influenced by this movement, of this artistic movement, the movement around Mozart, Haydn. Joseph II was the emperor whose court Mozart went to. Joseph II began a series of reforms, modeled to some extent on some of the reforms in the United States. And Mozart had great hope for him. And the idea that Mozart had was that you could work with a group of nobility in that area and actually create an enlightened nobility who would sometime recognize that being enlightened nobility meant you didn't need to be noblemen anymore, but you could act for the interests of all people and have a republic where all citizens are equal. So they had a plan to work on Joseph II. And one of the people involved in that was a man named Baron von Swieten, who in the 1780s was sent up to Berlin. 1770s he was in Berlin. He left Berlin and came back to Vienna and brought with him a lot of the music of Bach. Now, Bach, after he wrote, his music was suppressed. His music was revolutionary. It practically disappeared. Very few people played it, but they knew it in Berlin. So von Swieten, and I'm going through some of this quickly because of the lateness, but von Swieten went and brought the manuscripts back to his house, where every Sunday he would have the best musicians in Vienna, like Haydn, Joseph Haydn and his brother Michael Haydn. And one day this young, impish type character Mozart showed up. And Mozart was so taken by Bach, the idea of the fugue as a developed form of a canon, where you have a musical line that is repeated but against itself. And that in that process of repeating it, you actually create a second series of intervals. Not just the horizontal intervals, the note to note, but then a note in one against the second voice, so that you have 2 degrees of freedom brought in. And so Mozart studied this, and he then incorporated it in the period 1781 to 83 in all of his writings. And from that time on, Mozart was a transformed composer. Now, Mozart had only one very brief meeting with Beethoven, and Mozart died in 1791. He was probably murdered because he was involved with Baron von Swieten, Ignaz von Born, Prince Lichnowsky, Countess Thun, and a whole group of people in trying to transform Austria. And he had an idea: bring the American Revolution to Austria. But after the French Revolution, where the king and the queen got their heads cut off, and by the way, the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette, was the sister of Joseph II. Joseph freaked out after his sister got killed. And the idea that this could happen in Austria scared them. And when Joseph died, his brother Leopold was not such a good fellow. But after Leopold died, the Habsburgs went back to being the Habsburgs. And so Austria became more and more difficult. Beethoven, during that period, Beethoven moved to from Bonn, which is a small town, to Vienna. He was sent there by the elector to the emperor, who sent him there. And I'm going to have problems finding this. Well, the one thing I want to finish with this evening, because it's I just want to give you a sense of this, is the relationship now of Schiller and Beethoven. Friedrich Schiller was called the poet of freedom because he was trying to bring the ideas of the American Revolution to Germany. But he had very little freedom. He had to escape even to write his plays, to produce his plays, because he was supposed to be in a military regiment. He was supposed to be the doctor in the regiment. And so he was not allowed to do whatever he wanted to do. And so if he wrote a play, he was threatened with being sent to jail if he wrote another play, especially because where he lived was where the Hessians were being recruited, who had been sent to the United States to fight against the American Revolution. So the Duke, who was making money from selling soldiers to the British to suppress the Americans, wasn't too happy to have a young man writing plays celebrating the American Revolution. So Schiller had to hide out part of the time. Now, he had a friend, and I'm just going to show you some of the connections between Schiller and Beethoven, though they never met. He had a friend named Johann Streicher, who was at the military academy with him. In fact, in 1782, when Schiller sneaked out of the regiment to go to Mannheim to produce a play, Streicher was the guy who helped him escape. Streicher later went to Vienna, became a piano manufacturer, and provided some of the best new pianos to the young Ludwig van Beethoven. And Streicher became a friend of Beethoven for 3 decades. Now, in 1793, there was a protege of Schiller named Fischenich, and he wrote her to Schiller's wife, and it had the following comments. This is 1793. I'm enclosing with this a setting of the Feuerfarbe, which was a musical piece, on which I would like to have your opinion. It is by a young man of this place whose musical talents are universally praised, and whom the Elector has sent to Haydn in Vienna. Beethoven was sent to take lessons from Joseph Haydn, Franz Joseph Haydn. This young man proposes also to compose Schiller's Freude. I expect something perfect, for as far as I know him, he is wholly devoted to the great and the sublime. So a friend of Schiller's saw in Beethoven, in 1793, at which point he was how old? 23 years old, greatness. But what was he already working on? The Freude, one of Schiller's poems on Die Freude. Beethoven was already working on that. It wasn't for another almost 30 years that Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was composed, which included in the fourth movement the setting of Schiller's poem on Die Freude. So for 30 years, Beethoven worked on this idea of the godliness of man. Now, when Beethoven had been a youth in Bonn before he left for Vienna, Schiller's dramas were performed at the main theater in Bonn. The music director at that theater was Christian Neff, who was Beethoven's music teacher. So again, you have this environment shaped by the ideas of Schiller, in which Beethoven was a youth. Now, Beethoven studied many of the plays of Schiller. He loved Schiller. When he left for Vienna, he had these books that people would sign, you know, that you sort of like yearbooks. When you leave your high school yearbook, someone writes in, great knowing you, you're going to be great, see you someday, life was great in high school, hope your rest of your life is great. And then 20 years later you say, who was this? Well, they didn't do it quite like that in Beethoven's day. In fact, when he left for Bonn, he wrote quotes from Don Carlos in books of his friend. Don Carlos is one of the great plays of Friedrich Schiller. So, for example, to one friend he wrote, and this is a speech given from Don Carlos to the king in Act 2, Scene 2 of the play. He wrote, I am not wicked. Hot blood is my fault. My crime is that I am young. I am not wicked, not truly wicked. Even though wildly surging emotions may be my heart, yet my heart is good. It's a little bit better than great knowing you, you'll be great, see you in 20 years at the reunion. In another one, in a farewell album, there was a quote from Posa, the beautiful figure in Don Carlos, to Queen Elizabeth on advice he gave to Don Carlos. He says, tell him in manhood he must still revere the dreams of early youth, nor be led astray when, by the wisdom of the dust, he hears enthusiasm, heavenly born, blaspheme. Again, the idea of elevating your emotions and your soul. Or to another friend, he put a quote from the Marquis of Posa, truth exists for the wise, beauty for a feeling heart. They belong to each other. Now, this is the kind of education Beethoven had. He steeped himself in these poems. Now, in 1793, Schiller's play, The Robbers, was banned by the Habsburg police. They said it was immoral and dangerous. So Beethoven in 1794 wrote to a friend, he said, you dare not raise your voice here, or the police will take you into custody. So what I'm trying to get across is there was a fight for freedom in which the main fighters were in communication, even though indirectly, but on an emotional, mental level. Now, this censorship, just to give you a sense, it continued through most of the period of the Napoleonic Wars. It was finally lifted in Vienna in 1809. So in 1809, they started staging Schiller's plays again, and in 1810, Beethoven ordered the complete works of Goethe and Schiller. In 1811, he wrote to a friend, Bettina Brentano, who was one of the women he had been mildly interested in, and Beethoven was somewhat disappointed that he couldn't find an appropriate spouse. See, in those days you didn't settle, and you didn't necessarily hop in the sack with everyone you met. But he quoted in this letter to her, "Pity my fate, I cry with Johanna." Well, Joan of Arc had a problem also with this in Schiller's play. She couldn't find a suitable mate, so she had to carry out God's mission of saving France. Or when he well, you know, that some people call that sublimation. Or he paraphrased Joan of Arc when he took walks. Someone said, "Why do you carry your sketchbooks?" He said, "Without my banner, I dare not go," which is also a comment from Joan. Now, I have quite a bit more I wanted to go through, but I just want to give you a sense of this kind of fight, because the key thing in Beethoven's life was that he never really knew from one day to the next whether he would be under secret police surveillance, whether he would be free to write what he wanted, whether his ideas would get him in trouble. Now, one of the other things that was a theme for him was the question of the role of the artist. And he had a special problem. As you know, I'm sure you know this, Beethoven lost his hearing. Here's the man who's supposed to have perfect pitch, who is admired for his ability to compose as a youth. And by the age of 20, he's losing his hearing. And so Beethoven went through a crisis in 1802, at which point he was, 32 years old. And he had been treated by doctors who were incompetent. They didn't know what to do. And you probably have seen these things where he had this ear trumpet, you know, that people would yell into. But he became nearly suicidal because he couldn't imagine how he could have an effect on society if he lost his hearing. How could he compose? And so he wrote what's called the Heiligenstadt Testament in 1802. It's from the city, or the town of Heiligenstadt, where he went for treatment. And it's a letter to his two brothers. And I just want to read some excerpts to give you a sense of the struggle he went through, that he then came through in a very interesting way. He wrote, "Oh, you men who think or say that I am malevolent, stubborn, or misanthropic, how greatly do you wrong me. You do not know the secret cause which makes me seem that way to you. From childhood on, my heart and soul have been full of the tender feeling of goodwill, and I was ever inclined to accomplish great things. But think that for 6 years now I have been hopelessly afflicted, made worse by senseless physicians, from year to year deceived with hopes of improvements, finally compelled to face the prospect of a lasting malady. Though born with a fiery, active temperament, even susceptible to the diversions of society, I was soon compelled to withdraw myself, to live life alone. If at times I tried to forget all this, oh, how harshly was I flung back by the doubly sad experience of my bad hearing. Yet it was impossible for me to say to people, 'Speak louder about I am deaf.' Ah, how could I possibly admit an infirmity in the one sense which ought to be more perfect in me than in others, a sense which I once possessed in the highest perfection, a perfection such as few in my profession enjoy or ever have enjoyed. Oh, I cannot do it, therefore forgive me when you see me draw back when I would have gladly mingled with you. My misfortune is doubly painful to me because I am bound to be misunderstood. For me, there can be no relaxation with my fellow men, no refined conversations, no mutual exchange of ideas. I must live almost alone, like one who has been banished. I can mix with society only as much as true necessity demands." Now he goes on to talk about how, what a humiliation for me when someone standing next to me heard a flute in the distance and I heard nothing. Or someone heard a shepherd singing, and again, I heard nothing. Such incidents drove me almost to despair. A little more of that and I would have ended my life. It was only my art that held me back. It seemed to me impossible to leave the world until I had brought forth all that I felt was within me. Patience, they say, is what I must now choose for my guide, and I have done so. I hope my determination will remain firm to endure. Perhaps I shall get better, perhaps not. I am ready. Forced to become a philosopher already in my 28th year. Oh, it is not so easy. And for the artist, much more difficult than for anyone else. Divine One, thou seest my inmost soul. Thou knowest that therein dwells the love of mankind and the desire to do good. And so he concluded in this note, which started as a suicide note, that instead he's going to live for art. And that's what he did. Now, in this you can see why he loved Schiller's concept of the sublime. The idea of the sublime is this conception that no matter what affliction you have, no matter what crisis you face, what personal potential danger you face, you still live for the truth and for the good. Like Joan of Arc, who threatened with being torn apart by the Inquisition, having her limbs pulled apart, being burned at the stake. She held firm. She held firm to her mission, that she had a mission to save France as a nation. And she was burned at the stake, and she didn't capitulate. And Schiller's play ends by saying, brief is the pain, the joy shall be eternal. Because after Joan of Arc was dead, her example inspired the French to finally defeat the British, or the English, and win back France. And shortly after her death, Louis XI set up the first modern nation-state in France. That's the concept of the sublime. That in spite of whatever is taken out of you, or whatever risk you face, you still live for the good, and in fact, you enjoy the good. There's nothing that you're compelled to do. Destiny means nothing to you. Because ultimately, what's the one thing you can't control? You're going to die. So far, none of us has been able to escape that. All of us die at some point. We don't control the time and place. The question is, do you live your life for fear of dying? Or do you act for the good regardless of the threat? And this concept was something that drove Beethoven, a notion of free will. He wrote in one of his Tagebooks, the daily books that he had, where since he couldn't hear, he would have people write. He'd walk around with these little books and they'd write, and then he'd write responses. He wrote one time, I will seize fate by the throat. It shall certainly not bend and crush me. Now this is very similar to a quote from Schiller, who said in his essay on the sublime, let evil destiny show its face. Our safety is not in blindness, but in facing our dangers. Similarly, he wrote on another occasion, this is Beethoven now, all evil is mysterious when viewed alone. It is all the more ordinary the more one talks about it with others. It is easier to endure because that which we fear becomes totally known. It seems as if one has overcome some great evil. Now Schiller in the Aesthetical Letter number 25, in the Aesthetical Letters in the Education of Man, had written, man rises above any natural terror as soon as he knows how to mold it and transform it into an object of his art. So again, this idea that whatever there is out there that's fearful, you can conquer if you're not afraid of death. Now, on this question of resignation, Schiller wrote, let him be happy if he has learned to bear what he cannot alter. That is, there's some things you can't change. Beethoven wrote in response to this explicitly, "Fate gave man the courage to endure." Now in his life, what did he endure? In the early years of his work, he had many allies. For example, I mentioned Baron von Swieten. Von Swieten had been a patron of Mozart. He was also a patron of Beethoven. And Beethoven dedicated the First Symphony, which you listened to earlier, to von Swieten. There were a number of people, Prince Lichnowsky, who had been one of Mozart's good friends and traveling companions, later was a sponsor of Beethoven. But by 1811, 1812, 1814, all of them were dead or gone. Mozart died before he and Beethoven could ever really work together. They had one encounter. And Mozart said, "Watch this man. He has a great deal of talent." The police that came in, the police state after 1815 to try to shut down those people who spoke of freedom, of the dignity of man, the beauty of man, who had an idea of republicanism and the ability of man to solve problems and to express principles of beauty. They were killed, they were suppressed, and by 1815, Beethoven was walking the streets of Vienna, the Vienna where he was once celebrated, and people didn't like his music anymore. They thought it was too difficult. He referred to the Viennese as a rabble. He said all they're interested in, and this is an interesting quote, is their food and drink and pounding out whatever music they like. He said, the Viennese who used to exalt my music, now listen to Rossini. And if you know Rossini, it's rather pedestrian. So Beethoven became very demoralized. He stopped writing, stopped composing, got involved in family stuff, tried to adopt his nephew, which an immortal beloved, of course, because it's done by a Freudian nutcase named Sir Bernard Rose. Actually, the only reason Beethoven could have been interested in his nephew is because it was really his own child. And that in that movie, as you know, he impregnated his sister, actually his brother's wife, and that's why they always fought. You know, it's typical Freudian nonsense. But in reality, Beethoven's nephew became his legs and his ears, and he went out and bought the complete works of Schiller in 1820. And Beethoven immersed himself in Schiller in the last years of his life. And it was in those last years of his life, when nobody understood him anymore, his old friend Grillparzer, who had been one of his closest allies, one of the few remaining old friends left, he went in to talk to him and he said, "We don't understand your music anymore." And yet he wrote and wrote. He produced the Missa Solemnis, the late quartets, the Ninth Symphony, music that transformed the world. Now, how do you do something like that? He lived for his art, and he knew that his art would improve the whole society. That's what an artist is. An artist is one who takes the gifts that he or she has, and doesn't just go out for a quick buck or quick fame, but develops their mind to the point that they have a universal mind and can use that mind to create art that will transform others. When you really get inside this, and we'll listen to this next time when we listen to a musical dialogue between Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, what a great composer does is they actually know how the mind functions and how musical notes, or rather the intervals and the intervallic relations between the notes, as Furtwängler says, organize your mind to think. That music is not just something arbitrary. You don't just go up to a piano and say, "Ah, my first piano sonata," which actually some people do. But as Anna and Sky and others have shown, what we know as a note is not exactly self-evident, is it? As they grappled at the end of their panel with this question, well, where do the notes come from? Is it really just the frequencies on a string? So how does music reflect anything? What does music reflect? Music is a product of the creative imagination that has a physical existence. And there are musical ideas which cannot be expressed in words, yet which have power to move people and change nations. So that's what we'll be looking at when we get back into this question of Beethoven as a physical scientist. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover initially. Why don't we, if we have some questions, we can take a few. Yeah. Yeah, the Carlsbad Decrees, what was going on, the Congress of Vienna, which by the way was Henry Kissinger's favorite event. He wrote his doctor's thesis called The World Restored, which is about the Congress of Vienna. What they tried to do, you see, the American Revolution scared the hell out of all the old, corrupt, degenerate oligarchs in Europe. The idea that people could proclaim a government which would act for the general welfare of all its people as a sovereign nation state, that is, the people are sovereign, not the ruler, that scared them. The idea that this might spread to Europe scared them more. And so the Congress of Vienna, what they did is they decided to come up with a plan to suppress these ideas from Europe by having the Russian army as one enforcer, the Austrian police state under Metternich as another enforcer, the man that was called shit in a silk stocking, Talleyrand, basically negotiated the French role in this, and Castlereagh, who, to tell you the truth, was the guy against whom the Monroe Doctrine was drafted, the guy who wanted to come in and turn all of South America into a British colony. These guys drew it up, and they said, we're not going to allow an American Revolution to come to Europe. Well, but the ideas of the Weimar classical period, of Heine, of Schiller, of Beethoven, of Mozart, were so powerful that they were moving people. And so by 1818, it was clear that even if you had a police state, these ideas would still proliferate. And so what they said is, we're not going to allow these ideas to be presented. And one of it was like the Inquisition, which put the works of Machiavelli and other people on the index, the works of Dante on the index, that you could not read, and if they found them, they burned them. They didn't burn Schiller's works, they just said it will be a crime against the state to perform a Schiller play, and if you do, you will go to jail. And so this demoralized all the intellectuals. And so, you know, because, you see, it's one thing to read a drama. To actually see a live drama, especially a good drama that's performed well, has a profound effect. Don Carlos, you know, it's sort of like a great opera or a great performance of theater is something that uplifts you. You leave the theater, as Schiller said, changed. You see on the stage the sufferings and the tragedies and the battles of mankind, and you're drawn into it, and you want to intervene, and you're forced to think about this idea of empathy, of can I act for the better conditions of man? Well, if you're an oligarch, you don't want that. And so the Carlsbad Decrees of 1818 outlawed a lot of things, including the performance of the works of Schiller. Aaron, you had a question.
What is sovereignty in man and in nature?
Well, sovereignty means that you have rights that are inalienable. That you have the right to develop yourself. You have the right to work as you please, to perform a useful function in society. And the idea of sovereign human beings joining together to form a sovereign government whose purpose is to protect the general welfare of those sovereign human beings. That's what our Constitution and Declaration of Independence is about. That's what the Rutliot-Scene is about. We are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. If you have that, you're a sovereign human being. Now, you can choose to piss it away by spending a lot of money going to a bad college, and while you're at the bad college getting entertained by going to rock concerts and ball games and things like that. But the sovereign mind is the one that recognizes the responsibility that the talents you've been given imposes on you and then acts for the good happily and joyfully. So that's really the conception of sovereignty. Yeah, Samuel. Just speak up a little bit.
I was thinking about the letter you read to Beethoven.
Yeah.
What I thought about it is, which is the worst prison? Prison that others put on you. Physical prison. Yeah, how long is the worst? Well, the one that you set up in your own mind for yourself. Or you think about it, and I thought about Lynn. Which is the worst prison? They put Lynn in prison, but he did the exact opposite of what this guy expected.
Yeah, made him a hero around the world.
Right. So then the worst prison, that's the question that he answered. That it starts off with one way. And he decided that the worst prison is the one that he would set up for himself. And then he uses my action to better.
Yeah. Well, now think about this. Think about this, though. What does it mean to lose your hearing if you're a musician? And this is something we may also look at over the course of the next months or weeks. How do you compose? You know, is music a vibrating string? Beethoven couldn't hear a vibrating string. One of the things he'd do sometimes is that he would try to play the piano with his head against the piano so he could feel the vibrations. But he didn't hear the music. Or did he? Well, you know the old stupid saying, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, does it make a crash? Well, if you're deaf and you're hearing music, do you hear it? Is the hearing something physical? And then, interestingly, what did Beethoven do differently after he lost his hearing in terms of his musical composition? Where he was no longer limited, so to speak, to the actual physical sounds that he could hear. Did you have a question?
I think hear what's inside.
Well, but see, the question then is, in music, mostly what people think of as music is, you put in a CD and you hear something. You're hearing sound waves, vibrations. Now, there may be sound waves and vibrations, but his ears couldn't pick them up. So the point is, you're right. There's a higher faculty of hearing in the mind. This is the point I'm making about science, art. It's the imagination. It's the mind. So that someone who says, no, it's the way you pluck the string, the artistry, or you get these modern violin virtuosos who practically are fiddling up their, the dancing on the stage while they're playing to show how great they play. Now, the music is the ability to excite something in someone's imagination. Because a musical idea doesn't have words to it, but it's an idea. And it can organize your mind. You know, one of the things they're doing now, I mean, there are some different studies of this, but they found things, for example, if you take animals who listen to classical, if you have classical music playing around animals as opposed to rock music, that the animals actually develop, the births are bigger and healthier if you have classical music. There's a famous case of a guy who took white rats, and he had some of the rats listen to Clash and real heavy metal stuff. Some of them didn't listen to anything, and some of them listened to Mozart exclusively, non-stop. And then they released them in a maze. Now, the ones that listened to the Mozart got through the maze in seconds. The ones that listened to nothing took longer. And the ones that were subjected to heavy metal music sat around and ended up eating each other. This is true. It's a true experiment done by a high school kid in Virginia, which has been replicated many times. Now, one of the other things they're doing now with people with Alzheimer's and people with other kinds of afflictions who lose their memory, who can no longer remember things. They have listened to Mozart piano concertos. And they actually have shown that it improves people's memory, their ability to concentrate. And so there's something about a musical idea that acts on your mind even if you don't know what it is. You don't know that much about music. And that's why the great composer is the person, or the great writers, Helga always talks about Schiller. You develop yourself to get rid of your imperfections, so that in a sense you have a much more pure, unmediated, creative capability that you express to others, that it's your goodness that is the subject of art, not something outside of you that you're merely describing. Now, that's called too personal for us today. John, do you have a question? Okay. Yeah. No. No, they're not. No, I mean, there's no way you can demonstrate that or make that argument. The only thing they have in common is that when they're performed, they create vibrations and sound waves that go through the air. There's absolutely nothing in the creative composition that goes into rock music that has anything remotely like the creative composition in classical music. In fact, that's there's no connection whatsoever. Yeah. The tree falling, yeah.
We were talking about this on the way to the conference.
Mm-hmm.
Because is it your brain that's actually picking up sound, or is it your mind? Because like animals can pick up sound,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And
Well, are you asking, do you think if a tree falls and a dog hears it, the dog knows that it's a tree falling?
I don't know. I mean, once you
It's an interesting question, Sharon. You have any thoughts on that one? No, actually, animals can pick up ranges of activity, like a dog. The dog at Ted and Dorothy's house, Lady, knows their car. So when their car pulls up, the dog starts bouncing off the walls. If another car pulls up, the dog just says, "So what? Another car." No, the question of hearing is an interesting question, and we did some work a few years ago on this. I haven't looked at it for a while, but the old argument of a tree fall, I mean, that's pretty stupid, because obviously there's some creation of waves, or whatever sound actually is. It's propagated, so there is a sound.
if you're not there to hear it.
No, if you're not there to hear it, you don't hear that sound. So what? If you're there and you hear it, then the question is, what are you hearing? What is that process of hearing? Now, the mind then translates that sensation. As Lynn talks about, the thing about the senses, your organs, your bodily organs, translate that stimulation of the senses into an object, some kind of picture, some kind of learned response. So that problem with the senses, you're limited to experience. What happens when you hear something that's outside of your experience? You don't know what it is. Then you have to rely on the imagination. You have to come up with a hypothesis. What created that sound I just heard in Connor's apartment? What could that have been? We know that, that's right. So, why don't I take one more question, anyone? Well, what? Yeah.
I have one.
Yeah.
This is
Go ahead.
sometimes. See, I figured lately that I personally don't really understand a lot about music.
Well, you have to replace it with beautiful sounds. I mean, look, everyone in my generation could probably walk around singing the jingle for Pepsodent. You wonder where the yellow went when you brushed your teeth with Pepsodent. So here I am, 53 years old, and I remember that from when I'm 5, 6 years old when we first got a television set. I think Pepsodent's been out of business for about 40 years. I would recommend something to you. Quincy had this idea once. Those of you who think you don't get classical music, Quincy decided he was going to listen, just saturate himself with classical music for, what was it, a week? Something like that, you'd said. You did it, right?
I did that when I was...
You told someone else to do it. I assumed you did it.
I did do it.
No, the idea were, why don't you do this? Not just take any classical music. Take a couple of Beethoven symphonies. Take the first symphony, and then take the seventh symphony, and listen to them and see if you can see a difference. The first symphony is very much in the tradition of Mozart. In fact, even though I've listened to and studied music for years, I've played violin since I was 7 years old. Sometimes if I don't quite get it right away, I'll be hearing the first symphony and I'll think it's Mozart. But then listen to the seventh symphony, listen to the two of them. Then listen to the first piano sonata, or first piano concerto, and then the fifth piano concerto. And concentrate. Don't just put it on and, bake some cookies and organize your closet, but just sit and listen to the music for a while. Let the music organize you. Do that for a week and see what you think. You'll begin to discover things. You'll start hearing something. Miwa's not here, is she? Is she back somewhere?
She's here.
See if you can find her. I want her to just play a line for you and for you to think about it for a minute. But I think that's one thing you can do. You'll probably never get rid of some of the garbage in your head. You'll just learn to recognize it for what it is. Motoki, you got it? Well, not mutually exclusive. Can you just come? Oh. I just wanted you to play the Reach Your Car line in just a moment. Let me get back to your question. Can you? Oh, you don't have it? All right, don't worry about it. That's okay. All right, well, this is just a line of music. Now, this is a line of music that was actually written by a monarch of Prussia. And it has a few interesting things in it. We'll get into this next time. But it actually became the basis of a musical revolution in the hands of Bach. And it was all built around one note. Can you just play the first ascending part again? An F sharp. It's on the register break. Now, it's an interesting because here's something very simple. It was written by a dumb king as part of a challenge in the court. And Bach took it up and made something incredibly beautiful out of it, all around that F sharp, that bomb. And so we'll take a look at that because Mozart also found that interesting. So did Beethoven, so did Brahms. And you'll see how what might be an anomaly, because in a scale that goes da 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 da, a minor scale, the F sharp doesn't really exist. He added this, and it changes everything. And you use one note to transform Not just the written music, but what you hear and how your mind reacts. So that's what we'll look at the next time. Now, Motoki, on your question of the imagination and the senses, not mutually exclusive. But here's a question for you. Can someone who never has seen anything and never heard anything learn to read and speak? What do you think? Yeah, Helen Keller. A phenomenal story of a woman who was born deaf and blind and was taught to not only read and speak, but who actually had some good things to say. And so this is something that brings up this question of, do you have to have the stimulation of the senses to have an imagination? So they're not mutually exclusive. Unfortunately, most people today have their imagination from MTV and teenage sex sitcoms. You watch television so you can figure out how to murder someone and 27 different ways to undress. And then you masturbate about it for the rest of your life. Now, imagination was much better before the movies and television, I'm sure. And before strip clubs and things like that. Yeah, our modern world has messed us up. But the development of new ideas through the imagination, that's something you have to work on. You can't just sit in a room and suddenly say, Eureka! I had a great idea. People think that's the way it's like the old saying, he was an overnight success after 35 years of work. The discovery of something new requires that kind of work. But if you do it the right way and with the right state of mind, as Beethoven, you're doing it for the good, for the fine, for the beautiful in others, then that becomes something that's natural. And that's what is the sublime figure. The person who does the good instinctively for the joy that it gives them, as Joan of Arc did. Brief is the pain, the joy shall be eternal. All right, so that's enough for tonight.